afternoon, Prahamdar. My name is Caroline Phipps and I'm the CEO of Barod. Croeso, welcome to the 7th in our series of 10 manifesto webinars. Barod's manifesto sets out a blueprint for a more equal and prosperous Wales for people who use substances. We believe we can all do better to meet the needs of people who use substances, their families, loved ones, and communities. We need to drive forward innovation in policy and in practice that will help reduce harm and save lives of our fellow citizens. We believe we need to hold Welsh Government and Westminster to account and demand that we have a vision for Wales and a strategy developed with services and with people with lived and living experience. To find out a little bit more about our manifesto, you can find it on our website, along with more detailed policy papers in both English and Welsh, which will give you greater detail on our 10 asks. So today's webinar will focus on the specific alcohol exclusion clause within the Equality Act 2010. We want this alcohol-related exclusion removed from the Act. The Equality Act is legislation that provides legal protection from discrimination, but specifically excludes alcohol. We believe this is wrong and stigmatizes people with alcohol issues. So today's speakers will dive deeper into this issue. So let's get to them. So first up, we're delighted to welcome Ailar Hashemzadeh. I probably haven't got that right, but I tried. Director of Research and Public Affairs for Alcohol Change. Ailar, over to you.
Right, I'm Ailar. I'm the Director of Research and Public Affairs at Alcohol Change UK. I'm delighted to be here today to talk about this really important issue with Sarah. I apologise for my voice. If I sound a bit nasal, my toddler decided to bring a horrible cold in last week, so hopefully you can still all hear me through the bunged upness. As Caroline has said, today we'll be talking about the exclusion of alcohol dependency in the Equality Act. This is a subject that Alcohol Change UK are campaigning on and something that Sarah's done research on. So hopefully by the end of this session, you'll all be very well informed on this topic. I'm going to be covering what is the Equality Act, what is the alcohol dependency exclusion, how does this impact people with current or previous alcohol dependency, how can we campaign for change to remove this exclusion, and what have we done so far and what is coming up. And Sarah will be talking about her own research on this topic as well. So let's get started. So I thought the best place to start would be with the basics. So what is the Equality Act? The Equality Act from 2010 is a UK law that protects people from discrimination in the workplace and wider society based on 9 protected characteristics, which are age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage, civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex and sexual orientation. It consolidates previous anti-discrimination laws, making it unlawful to treat someone unfairly due to these characteristics. The Act applies to areas like employment, education, and the provision of services, and it also includes a duty for public authorities to consider equality in their functions. Just a note to say, obviously, I'm aware that we've got colleagues from across the UK on the call. The Act does cover England, Wales, and Scotland. Northern Ireland still uses the Disability Discrimination Act, but that also includes this discrimination. So I thought we'd start off with where the exclusion exists in the Act itself. So people who are alcohol dependent are explicitly excluded from the disability protections of the Equality Act. It's not an accident. This was a deliberate thing. And what this means is that for some people, it means that they might not have a right to attend treatment services or support, access reasonable adjustments, or even losing their job. For others, it can mean being refused housing or facing eviction by landlords or discrimination when trying to access healthcare. Sarah will talk much more about how the government justifies this discrimination, but I thought I'd include a a response to a parliamentary question that we'd asked 3 years ago here, because it really highlights the key issue, which is that alcohol dependency is seen as self-inflicted. Obviously, that's not my view, but it is what we've been told, and therefore not deserving of the protections that come from the Act. So as we've talked about earlier, the Equality Act protects people with certain characteristics, which include disability against discrimination. This can include disabilities which arise from alcohol dependence, such as liver failure, cognitive impairment, or cancer. However, what the Act terms addiction to alcohol on its own is specifically excluded. This gives you an idea about the role of stigma in why the exclusion has come to place. The government tells us that the exclusion exists because alcohol dependence is self-induced. We obviously strongly disagree with that view. I'm sure most of you on the call will as well. No one chooses to become dependent on alcohol, and anyone struggling deserves support without being discriminated against in this way. People with mental health conditions, such as depression or eating disorders, such as bulimia, are rightly included within the definition of disability and the protections of the Act. The difference in how these conditions are defined in legislation shows that while much progress has been made in tackling stigma related to mental health, alcohol dependence continues to be severely stigmatized. So, to illustrate how this exclusion might play out, I'm going to take you to a little quiz on our website that gives us some scenarios where the exclusion could become relevant. So our first example is a housing one. It says Lucas is refused housing from a housing association who know that he's dependent on alcohol because they assume that he might be violent or engage in antisocial behaviour. But there's no evidence that he has been violent or antisocial in the past. Is this currently allowed under the Equality Act? And you might not be shocked to learn that yes, that is currently allowed. Lucas's housing association is allowed to discriminate against him despite the lack of evidence for this behaviour. We've got a second example here, which says Sid asks his employer if he can take time off to attend an appointment for cognitive behavioural therapy for his bulimia. The employer says that he cannot take time off because his condition is self-inflicted. Is this currently allowed under the Equality Act? And the answer is, of course, no. You cannot discriminate against an individual seeking time off for CBT for bulimia. However, if an individual is seeking time off for CBT because it's going to help with their alcohol dependence, and that was denied by their employer, you would currently legally be allowed to do that. Example number 3. Sarah applies for a job and explains that a gap in her CV was because she took time out to recover from alcohol dependence. The recruitment panel thinks she's the best person for the job, but decide not to recruit her because of her history of alcohol dependence. Is this currently allowed under the Equality Act? And the answer is, of course, yes. This would be allowed to happen. Sarah would not be protected, as it's not a protected characteristics, and employers would be able to discriminate against her for her past alcohol dependence. And then our last example is Patrick lives in the UK and is fired from his job due to adjustments needed for his alcohol dependence. Is this currently allowed under the Equality Act? And the answer is yes, of course it is. Because people with alcohol dependence are deliberately excluded. If this exclusion was lifted, then Patrick's employer would have to make reasonable adjustments, such as allowing him, for example, not to attend an event that serves alcohol, because that's really important as part of his recovery. And what you can see from that is that there are examples around stigma. So the first example where someone's refused housing because it's assumed that they're going to be antisocial and violent just because they have alcohol dependency. It can lead to a lack of opportunities, as with the jobs examples that we put up. Somebody is perfectly qualified for a job, they want to work hard, but they might need some adjustments in the workplace, whether that's, like we said, they don't want to attend an event because there's alcohol served, they might be on medication, that means that they might need to start earlier or later, just stuff like that. And one thing that we didn't bring out in the examples, but I think is really important to point out, is that it's going to come on to what I'm about to talk about, which is the impact that exclusion has. And if we have an exclusion explicitly in legislation that says people who are alcohol dependent are doing this themselves, it's self-inflicted, then it invites abuse and how people treat those people. You did this to yourself. You don't deserve to be treated fairly. Obviously, we don't agree with that point of view, but it's something that we see happen in society, in the workplace, you know, in terms of housing and people who are working with people who have current or previous alcohol dependence all the time. So, what would be the impact of removing this exclusion? Well, removing the idea that alcohol dependence is self-inflicted is so important. I probably don't need to tell most of you that. It goes beyond the individual. Seeing alcohol dependence as self-inflicted completely ignores the environment that alcohol harm occurs in. This is something that at Alcohol Change UK we talk about throughout the work that we do. There are so many factors that can lead to someone becoming alcohol dependent, such as their life circumstances, their childhood, constant advertising and marketing of alcohol, how cheap and easy it is to access, their mental and physical health issues, etc., etc. To truly tackle alcohol harm, we need to focus on improving these factors to help fewer people become alcohol dependent. And further stigmatizing a group of people who are already heavily stigmatized doesn't help them, and it doesn't help us as a society to tackle this issue. If we remove this exclusion, it can lead to more people being open about their struggles and more likely to seek support. As a society, we treat people more kindly and understand the complexity of alcohol dependency. Rather than offer more stigmatization, we look at how we can help people who are alcohol dependent or who might have been to get the support that they need, which will lead to them being potentially offered crucial housing when they need it the most, or being open with a potential employer who's willing to support them through reasonable adjustments. And I've used that phrase a lot, just in case people aren't aware of what that means. That's just adjustments at work that are changes made to a person's job or work environment to help them from being at a substantial disadvantage because of a disability or a long-term condition. I also wanted to do a quick plug of a recent report that we funded with the think tank IPPR. We know that a wider conversation is needed around alcohol and workplaces in general. Our research found that the negative impact of alcohol at work is widespread, with almost 1 in 3 UK workers calling in sick in the past year after drinking with colleagues or at work-related events. 1 in 5 said that they'd said something that they regretted while drinking alcohol with colleagues or at work events. Exclusions like the one in the Equality Act mean that people are less likely to be open with their employer if they have a concern about their drinking. Or the workplace could potentially be a place that compromises any changes that they've made from a previous alcohol dependency. Like I said, for example, where they might not want to attend events where alcohol is served or go to all the socials that might mean that you get a promotion where everything is alcohol-centric. So I think these are really important. This is a really important context to bear in mind when we're talking about this issue as well. So how can we, this is the exciting bit, how can we change it? Well, there's 3 different ways that we've thought about. As I said, the exclusion of alcohol dependence is part of secondary legislation. It wasn't in the Equality Act as the first version, the primary legislation that went through Parliament. So secondary legislation is law that's created by ministers or other bodies under Acts of Parliament. By an Act of Parliament, basically. It's used to fill in the details of primary legislation, which is exactly what's happened here in the Equality Act, as these details can provide practical measures that enable a law to be enforced and operate in daily life. So this can be used to amend existing laws, and somewhere where we see this used quite often is, for example, to ban new substances in after a response to new information about their dangers under something called the Misuse of Drugs Act. So what we're saying here is that a whole new piece of legislation would not be needed, that would need to go through both houses of parliament, get royal assent, that kind of classic path to actually change this. It can actually just be done by the government of today through secondary legislation. I'm going to preface all of this by saying I am not a legal scholar or legal in any way, so I'm using very broad brush terms to explain some of the legal complexities of this. The other one is we've heard about legal precedents for all sorts of cases, and there's potential here for this as well, where somebody would literally take the government to court and say they were discriminated against because of adjustments that were not made at work, or they were fired or something because they were previously or currently alcohol dependent, and they win that case, and that would make the government potentially, take notice and want to change the legislation. But the bit that we at Alcohol Change UK and my team have been leading on is the campaigning work, which I'm going to share with you now. So that's the third way that we've been trying to, well, that's the main way that we've been trying to make a change in this area. So we started our work on this issue around kind of 21, 22, when Sarah and her team kind of brought it to our attention, actually, which we'll be eternally grateful for, because we weren't aware of it as an issue before that. But after many conversations and wanting to work together on this issue, we hosted a parliamentary event to take it to Parliament and see how politicians react to the idea of lifting this exclusion. So we did a parliamentary reception in 2022 with the APPG, which is the All-Party Parliamentary Group, on alcohol harm, where Sarah was a speaker and sharing her research into the topic, and talked to cross-party MPs, actually, and many of them didn't know this existed, actually. And the reception that we got unanimously, pretty much, was, why is this in place? It doesn't make sense. There didn't seem to be much difference in terms of, man, woman, party, political affiliation. There seemed to be really good, sensible conversations going on there. And what was really helpful about that event was, for me and my team, who do a lot of this influencing and campaigning work obviously on a daily basis, we really got to talk to politicians about, we got a vibe check, is this something that we could do a campaign on? And the answer to me came back yes. And actually, regardless of the government that's in place at the time or who the ministers are, it's something that you could work on, because there doesn't seem to be too much of a difference there. So that was our first opportunity to take it to Parliament. We then, off the back of that, launched a petition, which I'm happy to link to after I've finished speaking, which is still live. And we created a hub, which I'll also share on our website, which has a blog explaining the issue, the quiz that we've just done. It's got the petition and a fantastic FAQ that Sarah and the late Mo Dutton pulled together for us, that kind of go through some practical examples and questions that people have asked about this issue. So I'll link you to that hub as well if you want to find out a bit more information about this topic. That's what we've done so far. Obviously, the exclusion still remains, so we have to continue campaigning. So what's coming up next year is that we're hoping to do further campaigning amongst MPs. We are very much at Alcohol Change UK in kind of annual planning mode at the moment, so trying to think about what this campaign might look like for next year. But we will continue to talk to MPs as and when we meet them about this issue, especially those that we're more friendly with. We haven't actually been able to talk to the new government about this issue, so that's the real top priority, to get at least a ministerial response, hopefully a meeting. We've been told previously that the lead department for this is Department for Work and Pensions, so that's who we're going to continue to talk to. But what I really want to build into this, and what I've tried to do today by bringing up kind of real life examples, is not to forget the people who could benefit from this. And the real life examples, and to humanize it. As I've said, you could just look at it and go, oh, it's just a legal fix that needs to happen. But actually, we want to bring some storytelling and case studies into this campaign next year as well. with the real life stories of people who are alcohol dependent, to change the stigma, to change that narrative around it being self-inflicted, and actually talk about what this type of discrimination actually does to people. And we're really obviously passionate about that. So if you want to work with us, and if you know people who might be good case studies, then please do reach out. I'd be really happy to talk to you further about our work in this area. I'm going to stop talking and pass you on to Sarah, who will be able to tell you some really interesting research that she's done on this as well.
Thank you, Ailar. Thank you for setting the scene brilliantly. But I think it's something that we all feel really passionately about. One of the things I normally do when I start talking about this subject is I tell people that people dependent on alcohol and drugs are at really high risk of discrimination and unfair treatment and things like verbal abuse and name calling. But I suspect I don't need to do that to you as an audience. Having said that, something that is really important for you to be conscious of is that because of that level of discrimination, it means there should be really weighty reasons for the exclusion of substance dependence from the Equality Act. There needs to be a really good reason, and we're just going to explore a little bit about whether there is or isn't a good reason and the research that we've done. So I'd have briefly mentioned that in 2020, I wrote to the UK Government's Equalities Office to ask them why addictions were excluded from the definition of disabilities in the Equality Act. And they responded by email, and they said, the exclusion of addictions is because the provisions of the Act are intended to protect people with disabilities and conditions which are not self-induced. I'm not sure if there is a difference between self-induced or self-inflicted, but I'm going to carry on using their terminology, self-induced. And to put it mildly, I was very shocked to receive that and deeply disappointed to receive that statement from the Government's Equalities Office. As you'll know, the concept that alcohol addiction is self-induced is really highly contested. So research suggests that addiction is the result of that complex interaction between biological, psychological and social factors. And of course, we know that the addictive properties of alcohol heavily influences the choices a person makes. And it's also really puzzling to me why other conditions such as eating disorders, which are also frequently considered to be self-induced, are not excluded. And finally, that word addiction, Ailar touched on it. It's really problematic. It can be stigmatizing, but very importantly in this area, it doesn't have a precise definition. So using this term in the Equality Act risks misinterpretation and unfair or inconsistent application of the law, and that's important. So I prefer to use the term substance dependence, which does have a precise definition. It's less stigmatizing. I'm going to have to switch between the two terms depending on whether I'm talking about something that the government has said or whether it's something that I've said. So you'll forgive me for using the term addiction. I really don't like it. It's also important for you to know that as well as substance dependence, the Act excludes other things from the definition of disability. And these are a tendency to set fires, to steal, physically or sexually abuse other people, exhibitionism, voyeurism, and seasonal allergic rhinitis, which is hay fever to most of us. So addiction is grouped together with this kind of rag bag of issues, many of which are, of course, illegal. And the Act states that these are excluded for public policy reasons, for example, to avoid protection for people where the effect of their condition may involve antisocial or criminal activity, or they're excluded because they are not conditions that are generally recognised as disabilities. And I'm going to come back to these points in a minute. So my colleagues and I examined discrimination law in the United States, in Australia, Canada, New Zealand and the Republic of Ireland, and found that it's only the UK that excludes alcohol dependence. And that's really important because it shows us that including alcohol dependence in discrimination law is practicable. It can work in practice. But it's also important for you to know that protection of people with alcohol dependence in these countries is not without limits. For example, in the Disability Discrimination Act, or DDA as it's known in the United States, employers can still carry out alcohol screening, require that employees are not intoxicated in the workplace, and hold an employee to the same standards as other employees, even if that unsatisfactory performance or behaviour is related to their alcohol dependence. The DDA in the US requires employers to provide reasonable adjustments, such as leave of absence so a person can attend alcohol treatment, but they don't have to provide repeated leaves of absence where treatment has not been successful. And in the US and the DDA, someone who's dependent on illegal drugs is only protected by the Act if they've stopped using drugs. But in other countries like Canada, people who are still using drugs are protected. So it's a bit of a hodgepodge between the different countries, but UK is certainly the worst. So public opinion plays a really important role in shaping public policy. And because of that, with Ipsos Mori, we carried out an online citizens' jury in England to deliberate on whether alcohol dependence should be excluded from the Equality Act. I'm really disappointed we weren't able to include Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, but unfortunately resources just didn't allow. So for those of you who don't know, a citizens' jury is a small group of members of the public who come together to reach a collective decision on a policy issue through informed deliberation. And by informed, I mean the jury receives written information, they hear from experts, and they can ask the experts questions. So we chose to focus on alcohol dependence in this citizens' jury because other drug use is of course illegal in the UK, so there are legal issues in relation to drug use which we felt, certainly at the time, would benefit from a separate citizens' jury. Now the jury took place online during the pandemic in February 2021. And an independent oversight panel was established to ensure there was no bias in the plans and the design of the jury and the project more generally. And that was important because I think you can probably tell my position on it. I am biased. I have to make sure as a researcher that when I'm doing research, I'm not biased, but I have very strong feelings about this. So Ipsos Mori recruited 15 jurors aged 18 over from across England. And to ensure diversity, minimum quotas were set according to gender, age, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, geographic region, the level of alcohol consumption, whether or not somebody had a disability, and views on to what extent you would agree or disagree that addiction to alcohol should be excluded from the Equality Act. So the question that we're all here for today. And the jury was facilitated by 2 independent facilitators from Ipsos Mori, who were really experienced in deliberative engagement. So as I said, experts gave presentations to the jury, and the experts' presentations were on disability, on alcohol dependence, the Equality Act, and those arguments for and against the inclusion of addiction in the Equality Act. And you're very welcome to watch the presentations on the project's website if that would be helpful, and I'll give you a link at the end. Once they'd heard the evidence from the experts and had a chance to discuss it, the jurors were asked to vote on those 3 reasons that the government has given for alcohol dependence being excluded. So should it be excluded because it's self-induced? Should it be excluded because the effect of the condition may involve antisocial or criminal activity? And should it be excluded because it's not generally recognised as a disability? And finally, we asked them to vote on the key question, should alcohol addiction be expressly excluded from the definition of disability as defined by the Equality Act? To better understand jurors' attitudes and how they changed through the course of the jury, people were also asked to say whether they agreed with the following statements at recruitment, after they'd heard all the experts' presentations, and at the end of the jury. So the statements were, people addicted to alcohol do not deserve our sympathy. We need a far more tolerant attitude towards people addicted to alcohol in our society. Increased spending on alcohol addiction is a waste of public money. One of the main causes of alcohol addiction is a lack of self-discipline and willpower. And virtually anyone can become addicted to alcohol. And just to say, these statements came from the Scottish Social Attitudes Survey. Just to be absolutely clear, we don't agree with some of these statements, but it is really important to understand where the jury was coming from. So now to the headline findings. A clear majority, 11 out of 15 of the jury, voted that alcohol addiction should be included in the definition of disability. In other words, they thought that that exclusion clause should be removed. Interestingly, 6 people changed their mind during the course of the jury, and people were more likely to support the removal of the exclusion clause by the end of the jury. By the end of the jury, people were also less likely to think that people addicted to alcohol don't deserve our sympathy. Increased spending on alcohol addiction is a waste of money, and one of the main causes of alcohol addiction is a lack of self-discipline and willpower. They were more likely to think that virtually anyone can become addicted to alcohol. In other words, the jurors' attitude to alcohol dependence became much more sympathetic towards people with alcohol dependence the more evidence they heard and the more they discussed it with their peers. And of those people who thought the exclusion clause should remain, they were more likely to agree with the statement, one of the main causes of alcohol addiction is a lack of self-discipline and willpower, and to disagree with the statement, virtually anyone can become addicted to alcohol. In other words, those individuals who were supportive of the exclusion tended to blame people with alcohol dependence. So of the 4 jurors who voted that alcohol dependence should be excluded, 3 voted that it should be excluded because it is self-induced, and 4 voted that it should be excluded because it may involve antisocial or criminal activity, and because it's not generally recognised as a disability. Now, this for me is a really interesting bit. So the jurors' deliberations were recorded with their permission and transcribed, and this helps us to understand what influenced the jurors to vote in the way they did. So the most vigorously debated topic was whether alcohol dependence is truly self-induced and whether this should even be taken into consideration in discrimination law. So jurors who thought that alcohol dependence should be excluded because they thought it was self-induced felt that people who were dependent on alcohol were making a choice to continue drinking alcohol. As one juror put it, well, if it was a choice, it shouldn't be included. For instance, if a disabled person in a wheelchair could, at any time they chose, stand up and walk, I don't think that they should be included. But others believe that alcohol addiction should be included regardless of whether it's perceived to be self-induced. A juror said, "We cannot deprive them whether self-induced or not. It's their right, they're disabled, that's a fact. We cannot deprive them of what is rightfully theirs, that they're disabled. It's wrong. Why would you discriminate against between one disability and another?" One juror wondered whether there should be an expectation that individuals should participate in alcohol treatment if they're to be protected from discrimination. They said, "There is some grey area morally when the person is an alcoholic and doesn't seek treatment, whether they should enjoy the same level of protection." But some jurors believe that the excluding people on the basis that the condition may be perceived to be self-induced was moralistic and also unfair given other disabilities may occur because of the choices a person made. So one person said, "The self-induced defence is highly subjective and highly moralistic. That really is all you can say about it. Obviously, because people are moralising about other people's condition, that's perpetuating the stigma and marginalisation of people who are alcohol dependent. That attitude is preventing their rehabilitation." Turning now to how the jurors felt about the argument that the group of conditions that included addiction should be excluded because the effect of the condition may involve antisocial or criminal activity. A small number of jurors thought that alcohol dependence should be excluded because the effect of their condition may involve antisocial or criminal activity. For example, one juror said, "On its own, that reason would not be strong enough, but while you can't take it as a given that every alcoholic could be associated with criminal behaviour, there's a strong link. Neglecting that would be unwise." But other jurors thought it was unfair that other mental health conditions which may also lead to antisocial behaviour are included in the Act. They were concerned that blanket assumptions about people who are dependent on alcohol may disadvantage people unfairly and reinforce stereotypes. For example, one person said, "You're automatically stereotyping someone who has that. That's the road they're going to go down. You're categorising that person. I don't think anybody should be stereotyped like that." Another said, I think in that scenario, you have to treat each person as an individual case. One person reacts differently to alcohol than another. If you put everyone under the same umbrella, you're going to have discrimination. And now to that final reason given for excluding the group of conditions including alcohol, because it's not generally recognised as a disability. A small number of jurors thought that alcohol dependence should be excluded because it isn't generally recognised as a disability. One person said, I am against discrimination. I think everyone should be treated fairly, but I don't understand why it has to come under disability. I don't understand why there can't be another protection put in place, a different name for this to be put in place for alcoholics to have protection. I don't agree with the fact that it should go under disability. I know some people that are alcoholics and I know some people who are disabled, and as much as I love them both, I wouldn't want them to be under the same law. That's my opinion. But other jurors pointed out that other conditions included in the Equality Act are also not generally recognised as disabilities. For example, one person said, a lot of people's perceptions of disability is if someone's blind or in a wheelchair. A lot of people wouldn't think of people suffering from panic attacks as a disability. I think alcohol is very debilitating. At the end of the day, it's just a label, and if it means they come under the label to get help, so be it. Really interestingly, many of the reservations that jurors had about including alcohol dependence in the definition of disability actually came from a place of compassion. So, for example, they thought that people who are alcohol dependent might not want to think of themselves as disabled. If people do think of themselves as disabled, they were concerned that they may think they can't recover and then become trapped in dependency. Importantly, it was clear from the deliberations that the 4 jurors who thought that alcohol dependence should be excluded from the definition of disability nevertheless thought that people with alcohol dependence should be protected by discrimination law. It was just that including alcohol dependence within the definition of disability to provide them protection that they just couldn't get their head round. In particular, the fact that people can voluntarily overcome alcohol dependence was difficult to reconcile with their view of disability. But for some jurors, the right to be free from discrimination is absolutely sacrosanct. For example, one person said, excluding alcohol is fundamentally wrong. We've had all the evidence to show us that the impact is physical or mental impairment, and we can see that the effects are in most cases permanent. I can't possibly see how you can have an exclusion clause for this. The only reason I can see is that the scientific basis has advanced recently and has outpaced the legal basis for this exclusion. It seems a nonsense to me now that we exclude it from disability. However, some jurors were concerned about the impact of including alcohol dependence on employers and other employees. For example, one person said, especially if you employ just a few people, it could become difficult if one had an alcohol addiction and the other had a mental health problem. They couldn't do their job, but they're protected by the Act. It has the potential of crippling a small business, which is something to consider. But another person said, we all recognise the challenges this could place on businesses, but let's not lose sight of the fact that the US, Canada, Ireland and Germany all include alcohol addiction as a disability in their legislation. Included in those countries are 2 economic powerhouses that seem to function very efficiently despite accepting that alcohol addiction is a disability. That goes into the workplace as well. If they can manage the person management issues in the workplace from including alcohol addiction as a disability, I'm sure we can in this country. And finally, while, as I said, the citizens' jury was only about alcohol addiction, some jurors actually asked us why the jury had not been tasked with considering all addictions. And this led them to debate about whether drug addiction should be included in the Equality Act. Some jurors felt that it should. For example, one person said, drug addiction is illegal, but I still think if you're talking about addictions, who's got the right to say that's not included? To exclude somebody is just a person's point of view. If it's an addiction, that's exactly what it is. It ought to be included. But another person disagreed. They said, I totally disagree that other addictions should be included, especially drug addiction. If it were included, it would mean they'd legalise drug use. That would create a floodgate for the drug market. So to conclude then, the exclusion of alcohol dependence from the Equality Act has really serious ramifications, and it's out of step with the opinion of a citizens' jury and discrimination law in other countries. Excuse me. Equality and freedom from discrimination are, of course, key human rights principles. And while it's not a panacea, including substance dependence in the Equality Act may dissuade employers and service providers from discriminating against people. It could provide a legal framework to hold institutions accountable when discrimination does occur, and really importantly, empower individuals to challenge injustice. So you can access plenty more detail about the citizens' jury through our report and our policy brief, which are linked here. You can also look at the diagrams that we created to capture the structure of the deliberations during each of the 4 sessions. They're really useful because they show you what the arguments were and how other jurors kind of rebutted the arguments. And if you want to run a jury of your own in Wales, all the information you need is there. And finally, please do contact me at this email address if you found our research helpful, or indeed if you found it unhelpful, or if you have any other questions. And I'm sorry that I had to use the term alcoholic. It's not one that we would use, but it was one that the jurors decided to use, and I'm just using their quotes directly.
Sarah, thank you. Ailar, thank you very much. That was both different and both fascinating presentations today. Thank you very much. It just strikes me as having an act that has the alcohol exclusion clause. It's institutional sanction stigma that is just, and the fact that I think, Ailar, it was you was saying about politicians didn't even realise that it was there. It sort of snuck under the radar, yet causes such ramifications, from a sort of almost like a macro level of policy that, helps everybody discriminate against them. So that was really fascinating. And the jury, the evidence and how people change their mind when they're listening to a calm argument measured around this issue that can make really good decisions, based on the evidence that they have. Really refreshing to hear that in this very divisive world that we're in at the moment. So thank you both, fascinating. I'm just going to go to my colleagues and ask if there are any questions for our speakers.
Yes, unsurprisingly, after that fantastic webinar, we have loads of questions for you. So I'm going to hit the ground running with the first one. I think all of these are pretty much directed to both of you. So either decide who wants to answer or maybe you both want to. So what would reasonable adjustments most realistically look like for alcohol dependence in the workplace, especially in high risk or safety critical roles?
So we've mentioned a few. So it could be, the first thing could be like just around the presence of alcohol in the workplace. We know that there are some workplaces that are more friendly towards people who may not drink than others, whereas there are places obviously where any social interaction, any business interactions, with clients or whatever, everything is surrounded by alcohol. So it would be letting people not attend those events or kind of do something else. It could be allowing for time for people to go to appointments. So whether that's for their mental health, like I said, with the CBT or something like that, but it could be attending recovery meetings. It could be anything that's helping them with their dependency, whether current or previous. There are certain medications that people might take if they have been dependent. That means that they're not great in the morning. So they might want to work 10 till 6 rather than 8 or 9 till 5, And those are the kind of sort of things that you might need. Obviously, if you've got a physical disability from alcohol, then there might be equipment that you might need as well. I get the point about, I think the question was asking around like kind of safety critical roles. I'm trying to recall it properly, but I remember talking to someone from TfL for Transport for London about obviously like train drivers being a particularly safety critical role. They actually have a really good program for helping people with dependency anyway. But what I understand is that, you know, there are tests around needing to be sober for those jobs anyway, and that wouldn't be different for anybody in this role. All of the check, as I haven't linked to the FAQ, but it's on the hub. If you have a look, you know, all of the stuff around the workplace that we say is that someone is still able to do the job and they're the best person for the job. It's not to say that you make special allowances for people. It's just that you help them if there are certain things that they might need adjustments for with those types of jobs. So it wouldn't mean that people wouldn't be able to do those safety checks on the people, whether if that's part of the role that everybody goes through, that would stay the same, I would assume. But it's a question that we get asked a lot, is kind of how would this play out? I don't know, Sarah, if you wanted to add anything else to that.
No, I think you answered that really well. I guess reasonable adjustments are just that. They're reasonable. They have to be reasonable. And there's absolutely no reason that employers can't continue to do alcohol screening, and health and safety law always trumps equality law for any group. So nothing would change.
Great, thank you. Food for thought for everybody really on the call. The next question, Sarah, probably more geared towards yourself. Did the citizen jury say what was it that most influenced them to change their views for those who did?
It's a good question and an interesting one, and it makes me reflect on whether getting members of the public to talk about things like this is actually a positive intervention in itself, not just for this particular topic. Because when people start to understand that, for example, alcohol dependence isn't a choice. We all know that it isn't a choice really made. There's lots of complexity in there. I think that really helped to shift people's views. Also, the fact that a lot of the hypocrisies that exist at the moment, so bulimia is included, which of course should be included. Of course, it's a disability. Of course, it isn't self-induced. But how is that different to somebody eating too much, to drinking too much? And we know that there's a psychological element in that. So I think all of those things, and perhaps, and I don't know this for sure, but perhaps listening to some of those really articulate answers from some of the other jury members, I was just like, yes, you know, well done you for saying that. I think hearing that from your peers maybe makes you see things from a slightly different perspective. So we don't know for sure, but I'm really interested that it did. There was just that shift. I should say that one juror changed in the opposite direction. So they became less sympathetic. Not entirely sure how that happened, but that's the complexity of human nature, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you only had one of them, Sarah, that changed their mind that way.
Me too.
Okay, for both of you then, what can people with lived and living experience do to support this campaign if they'd like to get involved?
I've put the links on that question. So please join our campaigner network. You will be emailed about other things that we're campaigning on as well. We have a broad remit of issues, or alcohol harm related. Please sign the petition. I've linked to that as well. We have a share your story function on our website, and if you do that, then if people want to share their stories, if it's directly linked to this campaign, it will come through to my team, and we can talk to you, or just email me, honestly, if you have a story that you want to share around this issue. And yeah, that's what I would recommend that you do, because if you join our campaigner network, once we've started planning for our campaign for next year, you'll hear about what we're doing. There'll be different opportunities for you to get involved, whether it's going to meet your MP or, you know, continue to push the petition further, making noise on social media, all the things that we are hoping to do around this, then yeah, you'll be the first to know, basically.
Great, thank you. Lots for us to be getting on with then. And another one here, which is a really great question, I think. What would success look like 5 years on? And how would we measure whether this change has meaningfully reduced stigma or exclusion?
Shall I answer that first, Ailar? So it's tricky. Measuring is tricky. And it's particularly tricky because I think the strength of removing the exclusion clause is prevention. So it's not so much about a flood of legal cases going through the employment tribunals. It's about employers and other services knowing that they have a duty to prevent discrimination for this group. It's always really hard to measure discrimination. We could possibly look at the number of cases that do go to employment tribunals. We could do some qualitative work with employers and with service providers to try and understand what they've changed in terms of their practice. I do agree it's difficult to measure, but it feels like there's just like a moral imperative to make the change. I think I said in the presentation, it's not going to be a panacea. There will always be stigma and discrimination. But if we can shift minds, if we can shift attitudes to ensure that alcohol dependence and probably drug dependence as well is seen within the same group as other mental health disorders, then I think that is a huge result. It's just tricky to measure.
Great, thank you for that, Sarah. And I think we've got time maybe for one more question before we head back to Caroline to finish up. So we have a question here that is in two parts. So how can the outcomes of the citizens' jury become more influential on a political level to subsequently influence change? And the linked question is, do you feel something similar on general drug policy, such as that undertaken in Ireland, should be implemented?
I don't really know what to add kind of what I've said, other than my general feeling about this from the citizens' jury, from talking to politicians, from talking to people in the sector, is that people tend to generally agree this is not fair. And the sticking point is in government and in this kind of entrenched idea, I think, whether it's among civil servants or where it is, that, this kind of self-induced, self-inflicted, however we want to call it, argument, it doesn't seem to really exist as much in the rest of society. So where I see our role, at least as a charity, is to help government understand that that's not the case, bring those real life stories to them, and to keep campaigning and pushing for this change to happen. And the citizens' jury is kind of part of the evidence base for us making that case, I suppose. I don't really want to talk about drugs policy in general. That's not my area of expertise. We only focus on alcohol. So I don't know if I'm the best person to talk about that, only to say that obviously we're fully aware that the stigma that exists around alcohol exists around legal substance use as well, and we understand those arguments.
Could I just quickly add something? I guess there is something for people to influence the Welsh government. So this is a UK government law. I can't imagine how frustrating that must be for people in Wales to have that imposed on you. Ditto Scotland, who have also been trying to push things forward. So influencing Welsh MPs, influencing the Welsh government, getting this message out. We're all on the same hymn sheet here, all trying to achieve the same thing, and having some real emphasis from Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland. That's a slightly different situation in Northern Ireland. I think would be really, really helpful.
Great, an united response. Thank you very much to everybody who asked a question, and thank you both very much for answering them. I'll hand you back to Caroline.
Thank you, Sian. And again, just to say thanks to Sarah and Ailar. And I guess what I'm left with is a bit of a call to action, really. How can we do that active campaigning and influencing? We've got elections coming up here next year, in the spring of next year, which is why we've developed our manifesto. So we will be pushing that. But it is incredibly frustrating when we're impacted by laws that are in Westminster that are not devolved. But if we join with our other colleagues across the UK, maybe we can make an impact. That's something that we will be continuing to do as part of our manifesto. And thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and experience, and many thanks indeed. So that draws us to the end of this webinar. Look out for our next webinar, the date sometime in January, and it's going to be on drug checking. But just to say again, and also I would really like to say thank you to the team that put these webinars together. It takes a lot. They make them run very smoothly. Even with my accident-prone self, I managed to get through them with their support. So it is much, much appreciated. But thanks to everybody. Take care and have a good Christmas.
If you have been affected by any of the issues discussed in today's podcast, please reach out. Barod have a free and confidential live web chat service that is available 7 days a week on our website at barod.cymru, where you can chat to a trained support worker. Alternatively, you can contact Wales's National Drug and Alcohol Helpline, Dan 24/7, either by calling 0808 808 2234 or text Dan to 81066.